Resolving global conflicts, can a new world order suffice? Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another edition of your discursive program. It is a Global Insider brought to you by Globals, and of course today we are looking at the probability of the new world order bringing resolve to the numerous conflicts ranging from politics, economics, social, culture, and others, as we see in a more turbulent society. Discrepancies have marked the global stage as interconnected and largely proxy conflicts continue to mark the global stage, hijacking the philosophies of globalization, international cooperation, and the overall concept of a global village. It is more evident now that the society has moved from ideological war to a more and severe physical confrontation. The recent Middle East escalation between Israel and Iran, proxy and geopolitical wars, the regional conflicts, particularly in Africa and elsewhere, challenge an earlier opinion that the 21st century was going to represent a post-conflict and a more globalized society with respect for humanity. Faced with these confrontations, there is a dire need for global peace and solidarity to navigate the new realities of the world, which include changing power dynamics, among others. Therefore, we ask this question: can the precepts of the New World Order guarantee a clearer trajectory or scope for conflict resolution in the world at large? You are most welcome, and together with a panel of experts, we are going to analyze this topic in total to get some of the key points pertaining conflicts in the global world, conflict resolution, and probably if the principle or ideology of the New World Order is very practical in solving these conflicts that we are actually experiencing in the world of today. Thank you, and join you right after the jingle. Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to this other rendezvous of your discursive and knowledge-sharing program. It is Global Insight, brought to you by Globals, and we continue to analyze issues of utmost importance and looking at how we can actually bring some practical analysis that can help in solving interconnected problems of the world. And today our focus is actually on global conflicts, be it on the sphere of economics, politics, social, and what you can name the rest. And of course, we know that recently there have been actually viewpoints or opinions and even ideologies actually saying that with the new changes that have occurred or are occurring in the global world, it is imperative to bring forth a new world order that will actually not to challenge but replace some of the old world order principles which are no longer practical in the new realities of today, especially as we are in the world of changing power dynamics, of course shifting alliances, and of course new alliances. How can we navigate this peacefully to ensure the respect for humanity? And of course, like already highlighted in the preamble, it is a knowledge sharing program with a panel of experts. We're going to have a clearer understanding and of course highlight what is peculiar or what is practical as the world faces some severe confrontations which are no longer ideological, and now at the physical stage, we are actually looking at the recent confrontation between Israel and Iran. We can also note some of all of the plethora of crises across the African continent and more. And of course, without much ado, let's get straight away to the United States of America, joining Steve Gill, a political commentator who is with us this day to give his honor analysis or opinion pertaining a topic for discussion, which harbors on probably dwells on the ability of the New World Order principle in solving this crisis. Welcome to you, Steve. And I'll welcome you by actually posing a very important question. We're talking about conflict and the New World Order. Let's try to understand the key terms before looking at the possibility of this New World Order principle in solving a global crisis.
Yeah, Clarice, thank you for having me, and thank you for letting me speak with your viewers. I think that as we look at resolving conflict, whether it's physical, whether it's economic, all the other conflicts we see around the world, conversation like we're having is the first step towards resolving those conflicts in a peaceful way. And I think that as we look at whether it's in Gaza, whether we look at Ukraine, Russia, whether we look at Israel and Iran, all around the globe, even in conflicts within Africa, between countries and with some of the former colonizers who are still putting their heavy thumb on the scales in Africa. When you're talking, you're at least moving, hopefully, towards resolution, towards understanding. And I think what we see in the world too little today is the talks that can lead to peace, the talks that can lead to economic cooperation. And at least in those circumstances where we look at actual military conflict, when you stop talking, you head into more conflict, and you may not reach resolution, you may not have a successful negotiation through conversation, through talking, but you will never get to a resolution other than militarily or with more disastrous economic effects if you stop talking to each other.
You, Steve. What is the possibility of probably that a new economic order would emerge that can probably mitigate or curtail some of these conflicts which the global world is facing now along the lines of economy? We know about the confrontation between the US and China and other examples which you better understand. Do you see this new economic order as a way forward towards mitigating the turbulence that we have in the world now?
I think when you look at countries and economies, when there is a fair playing field where you can trade with kind of transparency and fairness, you're going to see more economic growth, you're going to see more economic prosperity. And I think that's one of the things that President Trump has tried to accomplish with his tariffs, pointing out that the U.S. has faced very high tariffs and very high other barriers, non-tariff barriers, to U.S. products and U.S. services getting into other countries. I think you're seeing those tariffs start to come down. You're seeing the basis of economic cooperation with the U.S. and China, with the U.S. and the United Kingdom, with the U.S. and EU countries moving forward as there's a recognition that there should be a reciprocal level, a fair trade level that's in place. And I think that will lead to more prosperity, not only for the U.S., but around the world. And as you and I have talked before, Africa continues to suffer under the yoke of decades, centuries of colonization that continue to take the resources of Africa from Africa to benefit the colonizing countries, the former colonizing countries. And the prosperity of Africa depends, in my view, on Africa being able to benefit from their own resources, Africa being able to develop and get a fair share of their own resources, rather than seeing all those resources taken away and Africa left in poverty. So I think that when we look at the tariffs globally, we have to recognize that transparency and fairness works there. But I think the same thing is true in Africa. We have to reach a level of fairness where Africans benefit from their resources rather than just Europeans.
At the moment, a political scientist and also founder of Global Export Club. Welcome, dear Julia. Today we are looking at very pertinent issues at this point in time that the world is in a form of turbulence. So what is your overall appraisal of our topic for today, probably revolving around conflict and global world order or new global world order? Hello, Julia. Steve, I think before we get to Julia, I think I'm going to continue the discussion with you, hoping that everything will be well for us to continue with Julia, listening critically. Now let's look at how the decisions by President Donald Trump were still on the tariffs, and of course now we see him imposing some probably travel restrictions on many other countries. And in our preamble, we made mention of the fact that these the plethora of conflicts have actually challenged or hijacked the philosophies of globalization and international corporations that probably brings about the practicality of the global village. So what analysis can you give to probably the decisions taken by the leadership of the US, and how this undermines probably the old world order of probably globalization and cooperation for mutual respect or understanding?
Thank you. And first of all, it's great to see my friend Julia as well. Appreciate anytime I'm on a panel with her. I think the challenge for the U.S. and what President Trump is trying to address is that for the last 4 years, certainly, and over the last several decades, we've had essentially an open border that has allowed tens of millions of people to enter our country, stay in our country, where we really don't know who many of them are. Many of them come wanting to work and get a better life, but there is no question that some of them come with more dangerous intentions, whether they are terrorists, whether they are parties to some of the terrorist groups around the world. And I think what President Trump is trying to do, as we have slowed the flood of those coming into our country across the border illegally to a trickle, now figuring out how you deport those who are here illegally, working here illegally, engaging in activities that are illegal, whether it's driving or driving without insurance, a whole host of crimes that are needing to be addressed. And then when you overlay that with countries that we can't really document very well, very effectively, who people are. They don't have a very strong ID system, and particularly from some of the countries that are sponsors of terrorism, we don't know who's coming in. So I think that the main focus of the travel restrictions is to figure out a better way to determine who people are that we let into our country. Now, we need to not overreach and prevent those who are our friends, who would be assets to the United States in terms of relationships, being able to travel into our country. But you have to start with the successful identification of who people are, what their intent may be here, and then make U.S. still accessible to those who want to travel here, do business here, and be a part of our country and our culture.
Thank you for that. Just to note that when sweeping measures come, we begin to ask questions as to why at this time we actually know about the history of the U.S. and if we see U.S. as a great part to this thief, we cannot actually undermine the contributions that came from immigrants. I think we'll come back to that for more clarity. While we welcome Julia Berg, political scientist and founder of Global Export Club. Welcome to the discussion this day, dear Julia.
Hello, once again, I'm happy to join the program today, and I think the topic that is being discussed is extremely important right now, because what we're facing as the global community and what some of the local communities are facing is a complete lack of understanding of the rules and principles that do define relationships between the countries at the regional level, at the global level, and this makes the overall situation quite unpredictable, unstable, and to a certain extent, or in certain cases, chaotic. So what we see now as well is a major escalation between Iran and Israel that also has risks, and the situation itself contains risks of use of nuclear weapons that both sides could be possessing. One side does possess those, and the other side might be able to have it quite soon. And we see the ongoing conflict in Ukraine that at the moment is being paid less attention due to other escalations. We see a lot of escalation points in African countries, and the DRC situation that is not settled, and it's been decades that it wasn't settled, and Sudan is quite heated, and the relations between India and Pakistan are heated. There was just a recent exchange of military activities. So we see that there are many of those hotspots, and we see that there are many areas that can potentially go into a conflict, and we see that those conflicts are not being effectively managed. On the one hand, we do understand that that the rules that were and the principles that were introduced by the UN are not effective anymore, because the Security Council and whatever it recommends does not have imperative, cannot be imperatively imposed. And then again, the UN and the UN peacekeeping missions are basically still relying on country-based troops. Absolutely. Which means that the UN doesn't in fact have troops of its own that would be neutral and that would be the force that is able to implement its power in order to settle conflicts, right? Yeah, sure. So the key question at the moment is regarding those very rules and principles that are supposed to provide some kind of guidelines for conflict resolution. And I think this is where we're kind of building up to a different world order that would be kind of like associated with some kind of sub-national structures or international structures of a different nature. And I think the big fight is exactly for that, for being able to define this new set of rules. So we see that BRICS, for example, an alliance that is not institutionalized on the one hand, and that is not really focused on conflict resolution, on military issues. It's not a military alliance. It's an alliance more based on economic and humanitarian activities that the countries exchange. Then we have some other organizations that probably would be restructured to a great extent, and this includes NATO, because NATO in reality was an alliance that perceived Russia as its greatest enemy, and now that the position of the US is different, now that Trump administration is more for doing business and is more for making deals, we will see that NATO would be losing the very foundation of its existence, right? Because Europe probably wouldn't be making it on its own. And I mean, it's quite ridiculous even to try, because the US military spending is times and times bigger than the military spending of any of those countries, and in fact it's even bigger than all of the military budgets of other countries combined. So there is no way you can avoid that fact, and there is no way you can compete with that, with the U.S. military might in terms of you know, the expenses and the actual bases that it owns. So just like it was mentioned just a couple of days ago by the president of Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, when he was talking to journalists prior to the St. Petersburg Economic Forum, the rules are very much unclear, because in different situations, different kinds of rules are being applied. And if you are Kosovo, then you can form a country without even having a referendum of a kind. But if you are Donetsk People Republic, even several referendums do not give you legitimacy in the eyes of the Western countries in order to choose the shape and form of governance within the region, right?
Sure.
So we see that what is actually going wrong is that there is no consensus at the international level, at the global level. That's why countries are becoming more defensive and aggressive at the same time, because when you don't have clear rules, when you don't have a stable situation that you can rely on in your planning process, then you start using violence, and you start using military instruments more than anything else. So we see that some of those efforts of the Trump administration in terms of peacemaking are also coming to sort of a dead end, because there are interests, controversial interests that cannot be met at the same time. So the approach has to be really different, and it's the framework where you cannot be talking about some fast and quick conflict resolution. So I think one of the key issues that is supposed to be examined right now is exactly that, the rules and principles that could be guiding the global community and its different actors.
About different actors and the realities on the ground at this juncture, dear Yulia, if we are talking about confrontations in the global world today, it is because of the fact that many people have understood the new realities, and like you said, when the old principles are no longer feasible, there is bound, you know, there's room for this resistance, and this is what probably has caused the turbulence that we have along probably economic lines, political lines, geopolitical lines, and a whole lot of proxy wars happening across the globe. Now, when we talk about the new world order, there are people who still have some probably difficulty understanding. I will appreciate if you probably highlight some precepts of the old world order and what the new order stands to present, and how relevant it is in the process of global peace, keeping or conflict resolution.
Well, I think that one of the major reasons for the need to change the global world order is that now we have a different set of countries that could be considered regional powers or global powers. So if, let's say, 50 years ago, the role of China at the international arena wasn't that huge, now we see that everyone basically depends on China in terms of, you know, its tremendous production, right? So China supplies pretty much everything, everywhere, all over the world. So the role of countries like Brazil, India, some of the African countries, starting from South Africa, but definitely not limited to that, is also growing, and this has to be considered. What has to be considered is that, let's say, France, Belgium, they cannot play the patronizing role that they used to play to that extent on the African continent. And due to the fact that there is a certain renaissance of Pan-Africanism on the continent, the type of relations African countries have with the global community has to be revised as well. And we see that some of the countries of Middle East are playing a greater role on the African continent at the moment, the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, and so on. So one of the key reasons why the global order is changing is that now there is a different set of actors, and relations between the different actors are to be redefined. And I think the same is valid for Russia, because Russia is not as huge in terms of economy, or is not as huge as China, for instance, or it's not as huge in terms of its military might as the United States. Yet at the same time, with the special military operation, it started the fight for the right to sovereignty itself, and the right to protect its interests, right?
Sure,
because
sure.
for quite a while they were put aside, and at some point realization came that Europe will probably never be looking at Russia as at an equal partner, unless that spot under the sun is taken by force, unfortunately.
Unfortunately, and of course, that is why platforms like Global Insider is here to actually help the world to navigate this phase with some comprehension of key issues, especially as far as international politics, globalization, and also the narratives of power dynamics are concerned, to be able to know how to go about it. And we this time around welcome Professor David Monda, an international relations expert who is also a policy analyst. He's joining us from the United States of America. You're most welcome to Global Insight. Thus, the professor welcoming you, of course, with a question. And we are looking at the fact that from the African perspective, some pundits feel like African countries are somehow entrapped in the present global confrontation, as the quest for new spheres of influences actually polarized the continent. With regional strife, we have diplomatic feuds, among others, derailing the country's strides in sovereignty and even global representation. So how relevant is this topic to the African continent, especially as we know a whole lot of regional crises? We can cite the problems in the Democratic Republic of Congo and elsewhere, and see how this has kept the continent in a very hot place.
Yeah, maybe before I begin, I just want to make a few comments, sort of around the context of how we're understanding this new world order, and then situate it from the perspective of Africa and some of the challenges we have. So the major challenge we currently have is we have a multipolar world which has multiple centers of power, which is still dominated with a post-World War II power balance. And I think this is creating a big global disorder. In fact, some would really challenge the notion as to whether we have an order or a disorder, whereby the global norms and rules, the rules-based international order, are really being challenged from a range of different perspectives. I think that the major issue we have as to why we currently have conflict is that not all countries follow those rules accordingly. And a lot of countries want to challenge American hegemony and Western hegemony of the post-Cold War period. and the post Cold War international situation. So I think that's really important to understand.
Absolutely.
I think another element, before I address your question in terms of the instability, on the African continent, is if we're going to talk about a new order, what order is this?
Absolutely.
Because if you're going to talk about, well, we want to say, give the BRICS countries, a bigger role. Well, BRICS is a cacophony, a mixture of so many different countries. You have major regional powers like Russia, like China, but you also have small, lesser developing countries, if I may use that word, in comparison to some of these major regional powers, like Ethiopia and United Arab Emirates and South Africa. So some countries are autocratic systems, some countries are dictatorships, other countries are democracies. But I think the underlying challenge with this order and conflict, as we understand BRICS, for instance, and this contestation for the new world order is, whose order is that going to be? Because even within BRICS, we know there's a power hierarchy. So Russia and China, obviously with their military and diplomatic clout on the Security Council, have very asymmetric relationships with, say, countries like Ethiopia or United Arab Emirates or South Africa or even Brazil. But coming to your question on, on Africa, I think this becomes another major problem.
Absolutely.
Where we have major power asymmetries even on the continent. So take, for example, a situation of South Africa on the African continent has a very asymmetrical relationship, even regionally within SADC, right? South Africa dominates the Southern African Development Conference. Egypt, for example, in North Africa dominates, the Arab world and the North African economies. Nigeria in the West, as I'm sure you're familiar with, Cameroon, dominates ECOWAS and the West African region. So there's a lot of power asymmetries that we think about. And if we're going to talk about a new order, what order will that be? And this therefore brings us to the question of, for example, what our previous speaker was talking about, when we talk, for example, about a special military operation of Russia in the Ukraine. A lot of developing countries are sort of torn between the United States, which has its own rules-based order, within which it dominates. But we should also remember, Russia, as a former Soviet Union, dominated a union of Soviet socialist republics, which did not always want to be part of the USSR, and hence the disintegration of that system in 1991. And what exactly is a special military operation? Does Ukraine not have sovereignty within this global norms and this rules-based order? How does Russia justify invading a sovereign country that has its own sovereignty? Ukraine didn't attack Russia, Russia attacked Ukraine. So I think as we think, then to your question around the Democratic Republic of the Congo, I think this then creates a lot of these power asymmetries to the point now that the DRC unfortunately has to trade off $2 trillion worth of its mineral wealth to the United States in order for the US to intervene and bring Rwanda and the DRC together, just so that war can end, right? This question of economies of violence, because there's so many other foreign players in the DRC, not just the US. The Russians have interest in the DRC. The Chinese are exploiting the minerals in the DRC. The UAE is exploiting minerals in the DRC, and of course, a lot of these countries are doing it through a small regional power in Rwanda. So I really think we need to be careful in terms of how do we understand what this global order or disorder is, and whose interests will be advanced. Is it going to be a new order where Russia plays a bigger part? But then what will happen to the African continent? Will China play a bigger part? Well, then what happens to Southeast Asia, where China has been very aggressive, say within, the waters of Southeast Asia and the Malaga Straits. So you ask a really good question, but I think it's very important for us to really define and understand what this order is. And if we want to fight for a fairer multipolar world, who's going to dominate this new regional space? Will it be Russia? And then will we then allow for big countries to invade small countries and take over the territory? Will it be that China has a bigger play? And where will Africa be? Because we know major powers like Russia, US, and China do not want Africa and developing countries to have a seat on the Security Council. It's not happened since 1945. It's 2025 and we're still making this argument. South America doesn't have a seat on the Security Council. It's dominated by the US, Russia, Britain, the UK, and China. The Philippines or Malaysia doesn't have a seat, or Cameroon for that matter. So I really think it's important as we talk about this order and try and figure out what it is, that we also understand these contradictions in terms of power asymmetries, but also the contradictions within major powers that want to use the discomfort with the international rules order as it is, the status quo ante, when it's convenient to them. But when major powers invade smaller countries and take over territory, and it's not convenient for them to talk about sovereignty and states' rights, then, it's a totally different framing.
That is where the bone of contention lies, Professor Monda. With all that you have highlighted, let's bring in probably the role of national sovereignty. We are conversant that the world has evolved, and as well we see changes, and of course the fact that many countries are now aware, and we can attest to the wind of change that is blowing across the African continent. So in your perspective as somebody who understands international politics, international relations, and its policies, given the challenges you've highlighted as per the New World Order, how do you envision, or probably what order do you envision as far as the world is concerned, especially along lines of power dynamics in the present society with the realities on the ground?
Fortunately, Madam Chair, the power dynamics of global power competition will continue. I do not see major powers, major regional powers, like Russia, like China, like India, like Brazil, or even like South Africa, taking a step back and having a lesser role. But I also don't see major hegemons like the European Union or the United States. I don't see them always playing to the rules-based international order when it is not in their interest. So take, for example, the convenience within which major powers on the Security Council decide to address state sovereignty. When it's in their favor, China will talk about a rules-based international order and will talk about states' rights, but will not want to give up the territory it took away from India during 3 wars they fought with India, between China and India. China will not want to talk about the states' rights of Tibet, right, which it took over. I think as we've spoken to with the current issue of Ukraine and Russia, right, resolving that issue will be very problematic because Russia will veto any efforts at a diplomatic solution, on Ukraine when it's not in Russia's interest, and so will the United Kingdom and even France when we speak about their interest. So as much as we want to see reform and we want to see a new order and see things change, I don't really see major power competition changing that much in the long term. But hopefully, as much as major powers want to dominate geopolitical spaces, as we have more common pool interests, for example, on the global warming with the climate crisis, as we have questions around legitimacy of right over might, whereby even though a major power like US has all the military strength, it also needs the legitimacy of smaller countries when it wants to either invade a country or it wants to advance a particular agenda within the UN. You're right, it has to establish some level of legitimacy. And I think this is hopefully what will tend to reduce this global hegemons and this issue of major powers, doing as they please, right? Doing what they can and having smaller states suffer what they must. But I really do not see this major power dynamics changing, for a long, long time to come. Realpolitik has been the international order, the dominant mantra, not just in the post-Cold War era, but even for many years before. It just came in very different forms.
Thank you so much, Professor Munda. Just to remind you, ladies and gentlemen, if you are just joining, this is Global Insider, and we are analyzing, of course, sharing opinions on the global changes across changes occurring across global lines, either on politics, geopolitics, and you can name the rest. And today we are focused on the New World Order and conflict resolution. Coming back to you, Yulia, and from what Professor Munda highlighted, we can see some sort of, I don't know if I should call it skepticism about the New World Order bringing practical change. And today, if we see the world in turbulence, or probably in turbulence, it is because of probably the existing policies or maybe agendas that do not probably align, that probably promote resistance, as what we have mentioned today while you were talking. You highlighted the Ukrainian crisis, the confrontation in the Middle East, and others. So now, to make this new order look different from what has been seen in the past, without probably taking side, do you see the probability of countries maybe bringing down their national sovereignty for the betterment of the national or global world, to ensure that we have a more balanced society that will respect sovereignty and all? Hello, Yulia. While waiting to reach Yulia, we were highlighting key points here. We're looking at the existing conflict across the global world. We are looking at the new agenda of a new world order, and of course asking the probability if this new world order can bring resolve to the numerous conflicts across the world, and also the position of institutions and organizations, the United Nations Security Council. We are looking at NATO. We are also looking at other peace-keeping bodies, and looking at the probability of these organizations readjusting or adjusting to the new changes in the global world, and how these new policies can be more inclusive in seeing that they instead mitigate the conflicts which are interconnected, because if we want to bring on the table the concept of a global village, the concept of globalization that talks about bodies, countries coming together either for economic purposes or political purposes. We want to see how resistance and new realities have actually hijacked these philosophies, bringing us back to the question of the importance of these ideologies in the world of international relations, which many pundits have actually said that it is due to, international relations is just all about power and firm and control. So today, just to note that we are live on Facebook, Pan-African Media Television, and also on YouTube, Pan-African Media. So you can always keep your comments probably of what you think about our topic for discussion this day, and see the relevance of a new world order. Do you think we really need new principles, new ideologies to be able to tackle the seemingly unending conflict across the global world? I don't know if Yulia is back. If you can hear me, Yulia.
I'm here. Yes, we lost you for a minute, but I'm happy that the connection is back again.
Okay.
Yes. Well, I believe that the new, let's say, the new actual balance of powers at the global arena does require a major revision of institutions, of the principles, and of the, let's say, philosophy and ideology of international relations, because the current world order basically is a result of the World War II. And this is exactly how the Security Council was formed, given the outcomes of the World War II and given the, let's say, the strongest powers at that point. So mostly the countries that entered the Security Council were the ones that had access to nuclear weapons or nuclear weapons themselves, right?
Sure.
And I just wanted to make a brief comment on the previous elaboration by Professor Mondo, because Russia has been actively supporting new members of Security Council coming in. And just to remind you of one of the statements that was made by the Russian Minister of Foreign Affairs, Mr. Lavrov, last year. So he said, "We support the interest and legitimate desire of India and Brazil to register in the Security Council, but at the same time, it is necessary to satisfy the African aspirations in terms of the Security Council." And if you take a look, you will see that this kind of statements were made on a regular basis for several years by now. So there is no issue in terms of that. But at the same time, those statements have not led to actual changes in the Security Council, and this particular discussion of making sure that other, let's say, regions like Africa, like South America, like Southeast Asia are represented in the Security Council. This kind of a discussion has been going on for years by now, and nothing has actually changed in practice. But it does mean that the position of all of the Security Council members is against it. That's just for the background of that issue. And at the same time, we see that even the existing formats of the Security Council and of the UN itself does not imply imperative implementation of the rules and principles. And we can see how Yugoslavia was broken into several different countries without the consent of the Security Council, and Belgrade was bombed without ratification of the military operation by the UN Security Council, and it didn't really stop NATO from doing so, right? Sure. So the term that came into place after those happenings is Balkanization, and Balkanization basically means breaking a country into several and creating complete chaos in the region. Unfortunately, this balkanization that we see happening not just in Balkans, but in many other regions, is the reality that was never supported by the UN Security Council and the UN itself. And moreover, thousands of sanctions that are imposed on Russia, sanctions imposed on Iran and many other countries were also not supported by the UN, which could have been the case because there is a procedure that implies that this kind of decisions are to be made by the global community, institutionalized within the UN. So something has to change here. I mean, one way is to actually make the UN work again, and another way is to create new organizations that would be considering the actual situation on the global arena with the growing role of countries like India, countries of Africa, countries of South America, Southeast Asia, and so on. And the ones mostly interested in that, aside for those particular actors, I think, well, Russia is on that side for sure, because it has also been in a role of a country that was dominated from the external side. And, well, depending on the aspect you want to mention, but if we take a look at the current economic system, financial system, it is definitely dominated from one centralized, let's say, area, and it's definitely not in those countries where the central banks are located in. I mean that, you know, the Russian central bank is not 100% controlled by Russia itself, because there are international regulations and, you know, the overall financial system that cannot be avoided. And I mean, even with the fact that Russia is cut off from SWIFT and many other things are happening, still there is no way to avoid the petrodollar system and, you know, those payment systems and whatsoever else, because you cannot just, you know, switch to something that is not commonly used. So a lot of aspects of the global relations do require some kind of a revision, and what has to be at the foundation of it is that very kind of relations based on mutual benefit, mutual respect, and respect for interests of each other. So, of course, going back to, you know, that statement regarding conflict resolution, if you take two conflicting parties and try to sit them at a table so that they negotiate, that would probably lead to nothing but a fight. But mediation institutions and mediation mechanisms and principles have to be in place. So we see that example with, on the one hand, the US making attempts to settle the conflict between Russia and Ukraine and Western Europe. And we see some of the first steps being made in terms of the efforts of the US and Russia to somehow settle the conflict between Iran and Israel. But those are processes, and those processes would be quite painful, and they would definitely be taking time.
Professor Manda, now let's come back from what
could you mind could I just make a follow-up to, you know,
actually I was the question was actually in line with
okay, go ahead. I'm sorry, go ahead.
No,
sorry.
Just go ahead, sir, go ahead.
No, I just want to make a quick comment. I think you know, I really agree with what my previous colleague has just said about the need for you know, the need to the need to have this new order. I think that the challenge will be, you know, for example, when we talk about reform of the United Nations Security Council, right? There's a lot of rhetoric, but there's very little action, right? So we really need to follow more what countries do than what countries actually say. And as you know, she rightly pointed out, Russia has been in support of, you know, a seat for, for Africa and for the global South more broadly, or seats for global South. I think the Biden administration was also sympathetic, in regards to that. But we also have to then understand, even within that rhetoric, both Russia and the US want to give an extra seat or extra seats to global South countries, but those, those Security Council seats will not have veto power, like the P5 have, right? So even then, there's that contradiction about major global and regional powers not wanting to 100% give up the control that they have, the P5 control over the agenda in the Security Council. And then lastly, I just wanted to mention, I think, as my previous colleague has said, we have a major problem with this new global disorder. I would actually call it a disorder. I think, she'd mentioned the former Yugoslavia. We currently have a major crisis around in Bosnia-Herzegovina, which is one of the former Yugoslav republics, right? Where, the Serbian, ethnic coalition in that country, wants to pull out. So there's really a chance that the whole Balkans can be destabilized in that regard. So it's really quite a challenge in terms of only determining if countries are dissatisfied with the former rules-based international order and whose rules are being followed and whose rules are being ignored. What will the new international power dynamic be? And I think we also really need to interrogate, should we radically change the current status quo or the current global rules-based order and the global norms that we currently follow? Or should there be a radical overhaul? Will that new order then create its own discontinuities or its own problems? Right, because if India, for example, is added as a new member of the Security Council, if Brazil comes on the UN Security Council, if South Africa or Nigeria or Egypt comes on the Security Council, remember now instead of P5, we'll have a P8 and we'll have a P10. So the current system is already dysfunctional. If we think about the UN Security Council, with the veto powers of 5 members. Imagine if you gave veto powers to 10 members, which means you've doubled the level of disagreement in the room, from 5 permanent voices with veto powers to 10 permanent voices with veto powers. So you might actually end up, I guess my point here is, let's be careful that we're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater. In other words, might we be better reforming the current system than wanting to do an overhaul when we're not sure what the post-reform order or disorder will be?
Okay. Thank you so much. And still coming back to the question with you, dear Yulia, does the new world order entail actually probably relegating everything about the old world order, or probably bringing some practical reforms that will encourage some sort of equality and flexibility in international relations, especially along economic lines?
Well, of course. I mean, if you want some actual changes, you can be you can be rearranging furniture in the house, but unless you do substantial change in terms of infrastructure and in terms of the way it's managed, you will not see much differences, right? So what has to be changing definitely is to a great extent related to the economic system and economic relations, because when you still have quite a monopoly in terms of the key economic instruments, when all of the deals one way or another are made through the US dollar, it gives a great control and monopoly over the global financial system to one actor who can easily abuse that very power, right? And so the same thing is valid in terms of the military activities. So when you have some countries like NATO countries being able to launch military operations wherever and whenever they find appropriate, and we could see that happening in Libya, we could see it in Iraq, in Afghanistan, in Yugoslavia, in many other countries, right? Then you know, what others would be trying to do, they would try to grow the muscles in order to implement the very same principles and approaches wherever they can, right? And once again, if you go back to 2014 and the very roots of the ongoing conflict between Russia and Ukraine, it's been a couple of decades that Russia was watching how, you know, Ukraine was growing that anti-Russian propaganda. Then in 2014, when the coup d'etat took place in Kiev, Russia still was not intervening into those internal and domestic processes. But what happened next was first a legal attack on the Russian-speaking population when Russian was no longer considered one of the official languages in Ukraine. And the next thing that happened was that the new Kiev government unrolled a so-called anti-terroristic operation against its own citizens in the east of the country. And for 8 years, Russia has been watching that happening. It has been watching people dying. It has been watching children being shelled and children sitting in basements. And you could hear all the quotes from Poroshenko, the ex-president of Ukraine, who was saying, you know, we will be living well here in Kiev, and children in Donbass will not be going to school. They will be sitting in the basements because of the shelling. And that was the official position of the president. But Russia still kept watching this happening. So after those 8 years, when Zelensky came in, and it was already clear that all of the Minsk agreements, all of those papers that were signed, and the presence of the German Chancellor Merkel at that point, and you know, all the other representatives of the European countries, that it was all just a trick that was pulled in order to let Ukraine grow the muscles. It was clear that you know, the situation was not going anywhere using those diplomatic and legal mechanisms, because they were playing in the interest of one side, and they were never even intended to be followed, which was again confirmed by Merkel and other participants of that process. So what do you do in a situation like this? And I mean, of course, any kind of aggression, any kind of military activities is not the way to be. But unfortunately, the current system is created in a way in which the power, as Professor Mundu just said, you know, it's might overwrite, unfortunately. And this is exactly something that has to be addressed when we're talking about the new type of relations that could be taking place, because as you know, humanity, we have not yet learned how to avoid violent conflicts, and how to kind of like protect our own interests without using those. So this is the flaw of the system that has been out there for thousands of years, unfortunately. And the risky part about it is that at the moment there are several countries that possess nuclear weapons, which means that the extent of escalation at the critical point could be extremely risky for the entire humanity, right? And this is what is exactly at the stake. And several days ago, when the escalation was launched between Iran and Israel, this was exactly the biggest fear that people all over the world were exposed to, that either one side would start using nuclear weapons, and that is something that unleashes an entirely new level of risks, putting pretty much everything at stake. So what is important to address is, are we actually ready to effectively implement diplomatic and legal tools when we're facing confrontation, major confrontation, and major conflict of interest? So this is one of the key issues, because in this kind of a situation, it's either everyone live in that legal framework or no one, because it's not going to be functional when some have more rights and others don't.
Of course, and it is bringing us again to another, bone of contention. Now, our focus is conflict resolution. Professor Munda, when you look at the discrepancies that we just highlighted, which you have highlighted and which Yulia has actually highlighted along with Steve, are we certain that we can have a world free of conflict? Because when we talk about conflict of interest or even proxy wars, and then we are still here talking about conflict resolution and the role of institutions like the United Nations and other probably peacekeeping or conflict resolution organizations, and being trapped in these realities of power dynamics and of course the proxy wars. Is there any probability of that what we are witnessing today will end sometime soon?
I love to be the eternal optimist, but I have to be skeptical on this one. I really don't see global power competition changing. But I think the nature of how we experience or we consume major power competition has to change. And I think the way we could reform the system, I think the way we should be thinking about changing the status quo ante, right? Things as they are and as they have previously been, is to think about those areas where major multilateral institutions like the UN, global institutions like the World Trade Organization, multilateral frameworks can be used to advance conflict resolution on areas where there's general consensus. I think that's an important starting point. So Ukraine, Russia, Israel, Iran might not be an ideal place to start thinking about these areas to generate consensus. But I think on broader issues like international public health, as you saw with COVID, how the global community came together after the initial finger pointing, when it became clear that this virus was killing everybody, whether it's a Russian, Chinese, Cameroonian, Kenyan, Nigerian, Brazilian, it was killing the global family. That countries came together, and you saw how quickly were able to come with with a solution, with antibodies, with medication that that treated the virus, right? So I think there'll be these areas, and I think it would be more important as we try and look for more multilateral frameworks. Unfortunately, there's certain conflicts where this would probably be impossible, I think, within the current global order. Russia, Ukraine, I think, unfortunately, the countries, the belligerents on both sides are too far apart. I think Israel, Iran, right? This is not a conflict that started in the post-Cold War. This is something that's primordial. So it goes back to the Hammurabi, to the Persian and Roman Empire, right? Those contestations. It's not something that's very easy to sort out. But I think more broadly, thinking about, again, other areas of global consensus, like climate change, like, gender equity, right? And gender parity, broad issues of how we understand the role of women and how women can be more empowered across global spaces. I think that's something everybody would want.
Okay.
And also in terms of use of, common pool resources, the environment and so on and so forth. But to answer your question in terms of realpolitik, of regional interest and global power competition, I do not see that changing anytime soon.
If you're highlighting the need, Professor Munda, for these reforms and changes, don't you think indirectly that is, what we are today referring to as a new world order? Because when you look at the ideologies, from what I know, these countries talking about the new world order, they are talking about a society where we will have, collaboration, but with respect of sovereignty. And I think this wind of change has actually positively affected the African continent, that we can today see the voices of African nations. We can remember the strong speech that the president of Sierra Leone presented to the United Nations Security Council, patterning Africa's position, the veto power, of course, and other aspects where Africa needs to represent. Can't we probably put all of these to be what we are referring to already as that new world order?
No, I think again I would push back on that. I do not see a new world order. I think more of a continuity of the same. Again, we need to distinguish between rhetoric and action. So the very specific question you raised about the president of Sierra Leone making a very impassioned speech at the UN Security Council, if you looked at most of the seats, they were empty. But when you have the Russian president or the president of US speaking, the seats are full. So by that I mean, we also have to be very realistic, Madam Chair, about the power of lesser states, so to speak, right? Smaller states and the global south. My point here is it's not an equal. We're not talking about equals here. When Russia is negotiating with Ukraine, it's not an equal power asymmetry. When Sierra Leone is negotiating with the US or with the UK, these are not negotiations of equal powers. Sierra Leone, for example, for its own security, is very reliant on the United Kingdom, right? That's the country that had to step in and stop that very brutal civil war. So I think even as we talk about a new order, I think we cannot overestimate the power of the global south and some of these developing nations. Because even those powers, whether you're talking India has its regional power dynamics that it wants to dominate that regional space in competition with Russia and China. For example, and India's own interests are directly related to power competition with Pakistan, which is another global south country. Brazil in Latin America, South America, is in direct competition with Argentina, right, within that regional space. And then even when you talk about the African continent, right, there's a lot of suspicion in SADC about the hegemonic role of South Africa, just because its military and economic power is so different. So I think as much as we want to aspire to a more equal world, we cannot ignore the current power symmetry. And I think it's also important as we reform the system that we also understand the concerns of major regional powers. I think as Julia had earlier mentioned, part of the issue around the Ukraine-Russia crisis is maybe the West and the US were too excited about the collapse of the Soviet Union, and they forgot that Russia still has regional and global interests. When we think about the Middle East, right, we know Syria's collapse was taken over by Western-leaning forces, but Iran has interest in the region, and if Iran collapses, will we have another Iraq type of situation of regional instability? So I think even as we talk about this new order, I still maintain there's still a global disorder where major regional powers are contesting the status quo ante. Russia is pushing back on the status quo. China is pushing back on the status quo. And we also find major global south countries pushing back. Countries like Cuba, for example, are punching well beyond their weight. Countries like Rwanda punching well beyond their weight. So as much as we want to reform the system, I think we cannot be too idealistic and not appreciate the realities that countries like China, Russia, US, European Union, they still have a major dominance in terms of global power dynamics.
Thank you so much, Professor Monda. And we're going to continue with the discussions this time around with you, Yulia. The goal, ladies and gentlemen, is to have a compromise on what is actually very feasible for the global world and which will actually permit the practical resolution of conflicts to reduce the turbulence or the escalation like what we see happening in the Middle East. We cannot actually, wear the losses since these two major escalations. Just to note that Donald Trump actually had to leave, maybe precipitate his leaving of the G7 meeting due to the problems in the Middle East. And it brings us again to conflicts of interest, which you just highlighted earlier on. But now we are faced with these realities, and we are also sure that we are conversant that the US has been very let me call it resistant as far as this new order is concerned, especially around the lines of de-dollarization and other aspects, not wanting to probably miss that position of dominance. And why should US resist to such changes if it is not actually very helpful to the global world, especially along lines of international relations and diplomacy? I would love that you should answer the question, Yulia, while responding to Professor Monda's pessimistic view of the New World Order.
Well, what is at the core, I suppose, of any system is the system trying to save itself and develop itself, right? So once someone gets the power, it's really hard to see that someone passing that power over in a calm and peaceful way. And that is one of the issues I think that is causing this kind of reactions from from the United States when it comes to the dominance of the US dollar and the petrodollar system. And it's the very same mechanism that is triggered in Western Europe at the moment, when they understand that they have lost their industrial might, they have lost their military might. They're completely dependent on the United States and on China on the one hand, but on the other hand, the ambition is still at the high level. Even given the fact that the wealth that the European Union is based on is the wealth actually coming from its ex-colonies that are still related to those countries in that neo-colonial shape and form, when political and economic instruments are quite enough to be benefiting from the resources flowing from Africa to France, for instance. So one of the key problems, of course, is the resistance of the existing systems that want to keep the might in their hands, and that are trying to adjust the legal framework to that and the actual situation to that. But we see that if we look at the history of, or let's say if we look at the known history of humanity, we will see that all of the empires have their own stages of development, and at some point they do reach the peak, and then they're doomed to fall and collapse, and it's an inevitable process, and this kind of transformations are definitely inevitable. Yet at the same time, the big question is again, how painful would this process be, and how many others would be dragged into this process during the let's say collapse, right?
Sure.
Another thing that I wanted to highlight when we talk about global conflicts and global conflict resolution or regional conflict resolution is the human level scale in those. Because when we talk about it, we talk about countries, but what are those countries? Countries are, it's population, it's people. And when we have so many countries dealing with violent military conflict, it basically means that several generations more will be facing the post-traumatic disorder and its consequences. It means that not just the ones directly involved into military conflicts, but also their family members, their friends, would be affected by that. And what we should realize is that once that door is open for violence, and once you have thousands of people or even millions of people involved into activities at the front line, even when the conflict is resolved and they come back home, they would still be followed by nightmares, by the trauma that they faced, and those people would have violent options up to killing available for them in their reaction patterns. And this is something that is important to understand, that you cannot just erase it, and once the war is over, you cannot just say okay and change the way of your instinctive reactions. So what does it mean? It means that when those people come back home in Ukraine, in Russia, in Iran, in Israel, in India, in Pakistan, when those people involved into those activities come back home, they would know that one of the tools that they can use is, from punching to shooting to killing someone if something goes wrong. And it means that their family members, their children, children of their children, would be affected by the trauma. So this is something we should always keep in mind, because another important thing to work with is exactly that, the psychological consequences of military conflict, the need to reintegrate those people into the society. The need to have an understanding in the society of how to react to those behavior patterns, and how to deal with it, and what to do about it, and how to explain those happenings to their children, so that the children wouldn't be in a trap of aggression or of kind of deformated treatment of others just based on the experience that their, let's say, parents had to go through. And the World War II was also a striking example of that, because even several generations after, we see how the paradigm of the World War II is still affecting hundreds of millions of people, especially, of course, in Europe, but not only in Europe, in other places as well. And the African countries that have suffered through the violence during the colonial times, that are still suffering from civil wars and external, let's say, externally fueled conflicts, those are, all of those are leading to generational trauma that people have to be dealing with. And people who have gone through this kind of a thing, they do not have that much of strategic planning, because you don't know if you're going to even survive tomorrow. And it affects a lot of things. I mean, you cannot be talking about constructive future, you cannot be talking about strategic plans if you don't have the basics covered, such as security, such as access to the very basic things. And if people are not even sure if they're going to survive at all, they're going to be making decisions that would lead to immediate benefits and would provide immediate effects, rather than slowly but surely building something of actual worth and value.
which is very important. Taking us to the next question, which we are going to direct to you, Professor David Monda. If we want to consider the humanitarian consequences of global crisis, and then do you think there is need to revisit the preamble of the international relations, knowing that its primacy lies on power and fame? But then when you look at the direct consequences, the actually is the human aspect of it, you see that the lower population suffers a lot from this. And this brings us again to the question which I would love us to maybe belabor. We've highlighted that already. The principles of this international power dynamics, or probably power competition, like others will put it, maybe to consider the human nature of it. According to some pundits, when we look at the crisis, let's see, the Rwandan genocide. When we look at the consequences, the people that died during the genocide, we begin to want to adopt the philosophy of some pundits that when these global proxy wars come in, the quest is to get control of the resources, the natural resources, the land, but then let's go the human capital. And I think, do you think the world is actually given importance to the human capital when, as far as global politics and probably power dynamics is concerned? And if no, what can be done now to probably bring a new phase in international politics and power dynamics across the globe?
Yes, I think you raise a very important point in terms of the humanitarian dynamic of the conflict. I think particularly in the post-Cold War era, specifically with the disintegration of the former Soviet Union, with the new global power dynamics around, for example, the Rwanda genocide, the collapse of the former Yugoslavia. The human cost, I think, is something that was underplayed before. But I think in the age of the internet, of social media, of cell phones, people can actually record a lot of these things. When we think about, specifically to your point, the human aspect of it, now when militaries go through regions and soldiers have masked their faces, technology, cell phones, AI can be used to actually unmask crimes against humanity, war crimes. But even having said that, I think part of the challenge with the post-Cold War disorder is that we've tended to normalize human catastrophe. So for example, think of Africa, where we have a majority of these humanitarian crises, not only externally, where we have refugees leaving the country, but internal displacement, specific to, for example, the DRC. In your country, for example, in Cameroon, Amazonia, that's a major issue, a major problem in the English-speaking part of Cameroon. We've talked about northern Nigeria, Maiduguri, and Boko Haram. You talk about Somalia, which in many facets is still a dysfunctional state, right? Only controlling Mogadishu. We have low-level conflicts in Libya and continuing human suffering and massacres. And my point in saying that is also to appreciate that as much as we are also then revisiting the humanitarian angle of this conflict, of understanding Yevgeny or Balakov or Antonov in the Russian-Ukraine crisis, to understanding about Mwemba or Mulama or Odongo in the DRC, right, humanizing these questions. I think part of the other dynamic is nation states are also very cunning about using human tragedies, again, in their own power dynamics. And very quickly, if I could give an example here. When, for example, in Rwanda, President Kagame is criticized in terms of the autocratic nature of his government, of human rights abuses, the Rwanda the world abandoned Rwanda when 1 million people were slaughtered and nobody said anything. And then people back off, critics will back off, and nobody wants to address some of the, genocidal tendencies that he's had to have through his proxies in the DRC, for example, where between 5 and 6 million people, 5 and 6 million people have died since 1994. That's its own genocide, separate from the Rwandan genocide in the DRC. Nobody talks about that. So I guess in conclusion, what I'm also saying is, as much as we understand humanitarian angles of these conflicts and the human tragedy, in many ways, social media and our cell phones have normalized that. The killing and crisis in Gaza, it becomes very normal. The killing and crisis between Russia and Ukraine becomes a new normal. The DRC conflict's been going on now for over 30 years, and it's become the new normal. I think that's very dangerous when we normalize human pain, when we selectively decide what parts of history we want to remember and how we historicize things that happen. But also, again, I have to go back to this, my realistic view of the world. I'm not sure Russian and Ukrainian tensions will end tomorrow. I think both countries have to find a new modus vivendi, a new way to live within the global reality. I don't think Hutus and Tutsis will agree in the Great Lakes region, but I think DRC and Rwanda have to decide a new way to move forward. I don't think, the conflict in Sudan, that the Darfuris in the west of Sudan will agree with the central government in Khartoum. But this endless killing and disregard for human life, I think, unfortunately, is a reality of this global disorder, where economies of violence, where access for minerals and competition for minerals tend to really devalue human life. And I think that's still an ongoing struggle, and I'm not sure I have the answer to that.
We're hoping that subsequently we're going to have an answer to that. Of course, we are looking at realism versus idealism, and almost concluding. Let's right off with Yulia with the conclusion. We are faced between nations protecting national security, ensuring that there is some sense in the ideology of globalization, and probably revisiting the preamble of international cooperation and relations. If we look at some of the wars that have occurred in the past, we see mostly ideological wars, and of course we still have those differences in ideology, and like you've said, Yulia and Professor Monda, these are some realities that we cannot actually avoid, but actually there is a way that we can navigate through if we bring in aspects that suits the present dynamics or the present era. So now let's analyze these two terms, realism and idealism, putting together global governance in the new world order, and how it will affect practically conflict resolution to mitigate the level of turbulence that the world is facing today. Yulia.
Well, I do not agree that that the actual basis of many of those conflicts was lying in ideological area, because in reality a lot of it has been very pragmatic. I mean, the US did not attack Iraq because of ideological differences. That was the cover, but the actual reason was the oil that Iraq possesses, right? The same thing, I mean, every conflict has several dimensions, but the driving interest unfortunately, in most cases, is the economic benefits that could be received from that. And Trump has quite dissolved the illusion of ideological actual bases in Ukraine, for instance, when he came up with the proposal to sign a deal according to which the Ukrainian resources would be prioritized for the United States. So I mean, this illusion of fighting for rights and democracy and human rights and everything else, it's quite dissolved. The very same thing is valid, for example, for the entire climate change agenda that was, in my understanding, to a great extent used in order to come up with those controlling mechanisms for industries and production. Because, all right, yes, climate change is happening, yet at the same time, it's a normal thing for planet Earth to be going through different climate stages. And there was the so-called small ice age several hundreds of years ago, and there has been, a completely different climate millions of years ago when dinosaurs were walking around and whatsoever else. So I mean, climate is changing. Sometimes it's getting hotter, sometimes it's getting colder. It is happening, it is the reality, but the way it was politicized in order to create control mechanisms that would allow to, through the control of pollution, that would allow for control of production and industries, that is quite an exaggeration of the problem itself, because you can see historical maps of Africa, for example, where Sahara Desert was non-existent. And at some point, this area of Sahara Desert was looking completely different. In Egypt, for example, you had much more areas that were used for agriculture, and there was no tons of sands over there at some point. And I mean, those processes are quite natural, and it's just another example of how ideology covers up a very pragmatic interest.
Sure.
Of course, the ideological dimension is exactly what drives people to take part in it, because if you tell soldiers, go fight for oil, probably it's not something they would want to give their lives for. But if they think that they're doing the right thing by saving someone from dictatorship, or if they're thinking that they're protecting their rights, and it's a different type of glory that they see around themselves when they go for that. So ideology definitely is an important factor, and this was very clearly seen, I think, during the Cold War, when the Soviet Union and the United States were representing two completely different ideologies and models of functioning, right? Capitalism versus communism. And you see that at the moment, the paradigm of multipolarity is very different from the liberal platform that is promoted by Klaus Schwab and Davos and all those actors. You see major differences, but it's not the key driver, but it's more like a framework.
Absolutely.
And what I think in terms of the way the conflicts can be resolved and a new system can emerge and whatsoever else, if you actually had some kind of an actor, would it be Russia, or would it be the United States, or I don't know, South Africa, or whoever else? If you had someone saying, okay, now I have a perfect solution for everyone, and here is how we're going to live as the global community. That would also sound quite a lot as as an attempt to monopolize the power, and that would probably be rightfully labeled an attempt to shape certain kind of a dictatorship on this arena. So I think there would be some kind of a natural process unfolding, and now we have some kind of a power test. To a great extent, the power test is taking place in the shape of military actions, but as an outcome of this power test, as a test of of the new economic mechanisms that are coming about in these current difficult geopolitical times when a lot of global trade is being reshaped. You have Trump with tariffs, you have Russia with sanctions, you have China changing its policies, you have South America and Africa that are navigating through those complications and trying to get their own benefits and get investment and development and trying to get funding for strategic interests and strategic infrastructure. And I don't think you would have someone who could give you a clear answer to the question of what should or would the New World Order be looking like. But it would be some kind of a natural result of this confrontation, that multidimensional confrontation that we're facing at the moment. And if that was to develop otherwise, just like Klaus Schwab was projecting and planning, I think it would have been a much worse case scenario, because that would have meant that the entire world has fallen to the feet of some guy who thinks that he's smarter than billions of people living on this planet.
Sure. And it brings us to the conclusion that there is actually some sort of a nexus between conflict and then power dynamics. But then we also want to look at what the vision for the future will be in line of they always say that the only thing that is constant is change. So for having a concluding phase from you, Professor David Monda, what do you think is that will be that reality as far as global conflict, interconnected conflicts concerned, and also the existing policies to maybe mitigate these conflicts or crises?
I think just in conclusion, very briefly, would be to say we need to be careful about reforming the system, because we cannot turn as a global system that's been around for over 60 years now on its head without something to replace it, something better to replace it. I think second point is we need to realize that we have a multipolar world, and regional powers also want a place at the table. I think that's a reality we also need to understand. But thirdly, we also cannot ignore the continuing role of realpolitik, right, of economies of violence, that ultimately countries will make decisions not entirely, but largely based on their core national material, security, and economic interests. And I think that is the reality of the global order. I think lastly, thinking about rather than trying to have unanimous consensus on issues, on what broad-based frameworks can the global community come to a consensus, whether it's respect for human rights, whether it's global equity, whether it's dealing with public health questions, and then ultimately then thinking about how to reform the global economic framework. Because we know in 2050, 1 in 5 people in the world will be from Africa, right? We have this global demographic time bomb. And if on the continent, the economic realities are not sustainable to manage some of the realities on the continent, in South Asia, we have massive populations. If those dynamics are not addressed, then even in the more developed world, in Western Europe and even in the North America, we will have major crises which will continue. So I think really finding those centers of consensus will be important in going forward.
Indeed, very important if we actually want to mitigate conflict which actually increasing in today's world, and if the world continues to be divided largely between the East and the West along political lines, geopolitical lines, economic lines, and even the influence of non-state actors bringing about probably different ideologies, strategies, and frameworks, it will bring us to more, I don't know if we should put it more polarization, but like you have underlined, ladies and gentlemen, it is imperative that the present status quo of international relations, especially as far as conflict resolution is concerned, should actually match the realities on the ground. Thank you so much. I want to appreciate your time and your insight on our topic for today, which actually focused on conflict resolution and looking at the probability of the new world order being a practical resolve to the plethora of crisis or conflict the world is experiencing at the moment, coming at a time where we have severe turbulence in the Middle East, that actually something that has occupied and shifted the agenda of media organs, not just across the Middle East, but across the globe. We want to thank you so much, ladies and gentlemen, for actually trusting the Pan-African television as we continue to bring forth this very discursive program, Global Insight, in partnership with Globals, to ensure that we bring in constructive analysis that will bring more clarity to how the world functions and what is needed in this 21st century to ensure a more stable society for mankind. Thank you so much, and it is on this note that we'll be drawing the curtains into today's edition of Global Insight. We want to thank you for your time. Do have a lovely weekend, and looking forward to having you again for another interesting program that will continue to analyze and seek for possible understanding, clarity, solutions to the interconnected issues of the global world, to keep strong the ideologies of international connectivity, international cooperation, and globalization. Thank you so much. Bye-bye.